I suspected my wife was cheating, so I went undercover as a janitor to her gala. I begged her, "Please, let's go home." She screamed, "Security! Get this crazy old man out!" Her lover poured wine on my head. Pathetic toilet cleaner. I removed my disguise and said 3 words that made them both faint. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Harold Whitman, and at 62 years old I never thought I'd be standing in a janitor's closet, pulling on a uniform that smelled of industrial detergent and other people's shame. The navy blue shirt hung loose on my frame, the name tag reading Henry in faded letters. I'd bought this outfit from a uniform supply store 3 days ago, paying cash so there'd be no trace. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending more on this disguise than most people made in a week. 26 years of marriage, and it had come to this. Hiding in plain sight to catch my wife in what I already knew was happening. The signs had been there for months. The late meetings that ran past midnight, the new clothes that appeared in her closet without explanation, the way she'd started holding her phone face down on restaurant tables. But knowing something and seeing it are 2 different kinds of pain. I adjusted the janitor's cap, pulling it low over my graying hair. In the mirror mounted inside the supply closet door, I barely recognized myself. Good. If I didn't recognize me, neither would Natalie. My hands trembled slightly as I clipped the fake ID badge to my shirt. Henry Morrison, maintenance staff. The plastic felt cold against my chest, right where my heart should have been beating faster. Instead, I felt nothing. Just a hollow certainty that tonight would change everything. The Meridian Corporation's annual charity gala was being held on the 15th floor of their downtown headquarters. Natalie had been planning this event for months, staying late every night to coordinate with caterers, decorators, and the guest list that read like a who's who of the city's elite. She'd mentioned it casually over breakfast 3 weeks ago, her voice bright with excitement about the silent auction and the dancing. She hadn't invited me. "It's really more of a work thing, Harold," she'd said, not meeting my eyes as she buttered her toast. "You'd be bored out of your mind with all the corporate talk." I'd nodded and smiled, the way I'd learned to do over the years when Natalie made decisions about our life without consulting me. The way I smiled when she forgot our anniversary 2 years running, or when she stopped asking about my day somewhere around year 15 of our marriage. The way I smiled when I realized I'd become invisible in my own house. But tonight, being invisible was exactly what I needed. I slipped out of the supply closet and into the service corridor that ran behind the main ballroom. The sound of clinking glasses and muted conversation filtered through the walls, punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed too loud, too forced. Rich people trying very hard to have fun while being seen having fun. I'd been to enough of these events in my younger days to know the drill. My reflection caught in the polished chrome of a serving cart as I pushed it down the hallway. The man looking back at me had calloused hands from decades of real work before I could afford to pay others to do the heavy lifting. These hands had built something from nothing, had signed contracts worth millions of dollars, had held Natalie on our wedding day when she promised to love me for better or worse. Now they were gripping a mop handle, and somehow that felt more honest than anything I'd done in years. The service entrance to the ballroom was guarded by a single security guard who barely glanced at my uniform before waving me through. That's the thing about being invisible. People see the costume, not the person wearing it. I wheeled my cart to a corner near the emergency exit, positioning myself where I could see everything but hopefully blend into the background. The ballroom was magnificent, I had to admit. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across marble floors that probably cost more than most people's houses. Women in gowns that cost thousands of dollars glided between men in custom-tailored tuxedos, everyone holding champagne flutes that caught the light like tiny diamonds. The air smelled of expensive perfume, aged whiskey, and the particular scent of old money, leather and privilege and the absence of worry. It took me less than 5 minutes to spot Natalie. She stood near the silent auction tables, her black evening gown hugging curves that I used to trace with my fingertips on Sunday mornings when the world was quiet and she was still mine. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon that exposed the nape of her neck, the same spot I used to kiss when she'd lean over the kitchen sink washing dishes in our first apartment. She looked beautiful. She always looked beautiful. That had never been our problem. The man beside her was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of confident posture that came from never having been told no. His hand rested on the small of Natalie's back with a familiarity that made my chest tighten. This had to be Marcus Reed, Meridian's finance director. I'd heard his name mentioned at dinner parties, seen it in the company directory when I'd done my research. Natalie had described him as brilliant with numbers and really understanding of the pressures we face. Now I understood exactly what kind of pressure she'd been talking about. I began moving slowly around the perimeter of the room, emptying ashtrays that were already empty, wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. The perfect wallpaper that no one would remember seeing. A group of women in pearls and politics discussed their children's Ivy League acceptances while stepping around me like I was furniture. A cluster of men debated golf handicaps and tax shelters, their voices dropping automatically when I approached, as if the help might be listening. If they only knew. Natalie and Marcus had moved to the dance floor. Her head was tilted back in laughter at something he'd whispered in her ear, her hand resting on his chest in a gesture so intimate it made my throat close. I watched as he spun her around, her dress flaring out like a flower blooming in reverse. They moved together like they'd done this before, many times before. I found myself standing near the bar, polishing the same spot on a marble-top table while my wife danced with another man. The bartender, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced at me sympathetically. "Long night, huh?" she said quietly, thinking she was commiserating with a fellow service worker. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because it was a long night. It was the longest night of a marriage that had been dying by degrees for years, and I was finally ready to pronounce it dead. That's when Marcus Reed noticed me watching them. He said something to Natalie, nodding in my direction. She turned her eyes, scanning the crowd until they landed on me. For a moment, I thought she might recognize something familiar in my posture, the way I held my shoulders, the shape of my face under the janitor's cap. For a moment, I thought 26 years of marriage might mean something. Instead, her expression shifted to mild annoyance, the way someone might look at a fly that had wandered into their line of sight. Marcus began walking toward me, Natalie following slightly behind, her champagne flute held like a weapon. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told to lower it. "Is there something you need from this area?" I straightened up, keeping my eyes down the way I'd seen other service workers do. "Just cleaning, sir. Sorry if I'm in the way." "Well, you are in the way," he continued, his tone growing sharper. "This is a private event for invited guests only. I don't think the cleaning staff needs to be wandering around during the party." Natalie stepped up beside him, her face a mask of polite distaste. "Maybe you should check with your supervisor," she said, looking at me the way she might look at a stain on her dress. "I'm sure there are other areas that need your attention." I lifted my eyes to meet hers for just a moment. My wife, of 26 years. The woman who'd cried in my arms when her father died. The woman who'd made me laugh until my sides hurt during our first Christmas together. The woman who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. She looked through me like I was glass. "Yes, ma'am," I said quietly. "Sorry for the disturbance." But as I started to wheel my cart away, Marcus wasn't finished. "Wait a minute," he called out, loud enough that other guests began to notice. "I want to make sure we don't have this problem again." He strode over to where I'd stopped, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor like countdown timer. The crowd began to form a loose circle around us, drawn by the promise of drama at an otherwise predictable evening. "What's your name?" Marcus demanded, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. "Henry Morrison, sir." "Well, Henry," he said, drawing out the name like it tasted bad in his mouth, "let me explain how this works. When important people are having important conversations, the help needs to stay invisible. Do you understand what invisible means? The circle of guests grew tighter. I could hear whispers, see phones being discreetly raised to capture whatever was about to happen. Natalie stood behind Marcus, her champagne flute raised to her lips, watching the show with detached interest. "I understand, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I don't think you do," Marcus continued, reaching for his wine glass. "I think you need a reminder of your place." That's when he poured the entire contents of his glass over my head. The red wine was cold against my scalp, soaking through the janitor's cap and running down my face in sticky rivulets. It dripped onto my uniform shirt, staining the navy fabric purple-black. The crowd gasped and murmured, some pulling out phones to record the humiliation of the pathetic janitor who dared to interrupt their evening. "There," Marcus said, setting his empty glass on my cleaning cart with a satisfied smile. "Now you're properly invisible." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of nervous amusement that people make when they witness someone else's degradation and are grateful it's not them. The kind of laughter that says better you than me and know your place, and this is what happens when you forget where you belong. I stood there dripping wine onto the marble floor, my hands clenched at my sides, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The smart thing would be to apologize, to clean up the mess, to disappear into the service corridors and never be seen again. The smart thing would be to retreat and lick my wounds and plan my next move from the shadows. Instead, I slowly reached up and wiped the wine from my eyes. And when I looked at Marcus Reed, when I looked at my wife, when I looked at the crowd of people who just watched a man be humiliated for their entertainment, something in my expression must have changed. Because the laughter died in their throats and suddenly the ballroom felt very, very quiet. Marcus took a small step backward, his confidence flickering for just a moment. Natalie's champagne flute paused halfway to her lips, and I smiled. The smile that crossed my face wasn't pleasant. It was the smile of a man who just realized he was playing a completely different game than everyone else in the room. Marcus must have seen something in it that he didn't like, because his swagger faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Is something funny, old man?" he asked, his voice pitched loud enough to reclaim the attention of the crowd that had begun to drift away. I wiped more wine from my cheek with the sleeve of my uniform shirt, the fabric already stained beyond salvation. "No, sir, nothing funny at all. Just thinking about how things have a way of working out." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Marcus stepped closer, close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, probably from some childhood adventure that his parents' money had smoothed over. "Nothing, sir. Just that spilled wine always leaves a stain, no matter how expensive the vintage." Natalie finally spoke up, her voice sharp with irritation. "Marcus, maybe we should just let security handle this. The man is clearly unstable." She looked at me with such pure disgust that I almost forgot we'd shared a bed for 26 years. Almost forgot that she used to curl up against my chest during thunderstorms, that she'd held my hand in the hospital waiting room when my mother was dying, that she'd once told me I was her safe harbor in a chaotic world. That woman was gone, if she'd ever really existed. In her place stood someone who could watch her husband be degraded by her lover and feel nothing but annoyance at the inconvenience. "Unstable," I repeated quietly, tasting the word. "You might be right about that, ma'am." Marcus grabbed my shoulder, his grip tight enough to leave bruises through the thin uniform shirt. "Listen carefully, you pathetic toilet cleaner. You're going to take your little cart and disappear, or I'm going to make sure you never work in this city again. Do you understand me?" I looked down at his hand on my shoulder, then back up at his face. "I understand perfectly, sir, crystal clear." But I didn't move. Couldn't move, really. Because something was happening to me in that marble-floored ballroom surrounded by people who saw me as less than human. 26 years of swallowing my pride, of making myself smaller to make Natalie comfortable, of pretending that love meant accepting scraps. It was all crystallizing into something hard and unbreakable in my chest. I said, "Move," Marcus hissed, his grip tightening. "And I heard you," I replied, my voice still calm, still respectful. "Just wondering if you'd mind answering a question first." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. These people lived their carefully curated lives in boardrooms and country clubs, their biggest risks, calculated investments, and social missteps. Witnessing the humiliation of the help was probably the most excitement they'd had in months. "What question?" Marcus demanded, clearly irritated that his authority wasn't having the immediate effect he expected. "Just curious about the wine, sir. What vintage was that? Seemed expensive, the way it tasted coming down my face." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Marcus's face reddened, but I could see something else in his expression now, uncertainty. He wasn't used to his victims talking back. "It was a 1997 Bordeaux, you ignorant bastard, worth more than you make in a year." 1997, I repeated thoughtfully. "Good year. Though I personally prefer the 95, better balance between the tannins and the fruit, but then taste is subjective, isn't it?" The crowd had gone very quiet now. A janitor discussing wine vintages wasn't fitting the script they'd expected. Marcus's hand fell away from my shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" "I said taste is subjective. Some people prefer bold flavors, others appreciate subtlety. Some people think expensive means good, others know that real value comes from understanding what you're actually consuming." Natalie stepped forward, her face pale. For the first time since this confrontation began, she was really looking at me, really seeing me. And I could tell that something in my voice, some familiar cadence, was triggering a memory she couldn't quite place. "Marcus," she said quietly, her champagne flute trembling in her hand, "maybe we should—" "Shut up," he snapped, not taking his eyes off me. "I want to hear more from our wine expert here. Tell me, Henry, where exactly does a janitor learn about Bordeaux vintages?" I bent down and picked up my mop from the cart, wringing it out slowly, deliberately. The movements were meditative, giving me time to consider my next words carefully. Because this was the moment when I could retreat into the shadows and execute my plans quietly, or the moment when I could start revealing just enough truth to make them both very, very uncomfortable. "You'd be surprised what a man learns over the years, sir, especially when he's paying attention while other people think he's invisible." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Marcus's voice was rising now, drawing even more attention from the other guests. I straightened up, mop in hand, and looked him directly in the eyes. "It means that being underestimated can be a powerful thing, Mr. Reed." The use of his name hit him like a slap. He hadn't introduced himself. No one had. But there it was, spoken by a janitor who shouldn't have known who he was or cared enough to find out. "How do you—" he began. "How do I know your name?" I finished for him. "Same way I know about the 1997 Bordeaux, same way I know about a lot of things that might surprise you." Natalie's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of crystal and golden liquid. The sound was sharp enough to make several people jump, but my eyes never left Marcus's face. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to process how cleaning man knew details he shouldn't know. "You're insane," Marcus said, but there was less conviction in it now. "Maybe," I agreed. "But insanity is just another word for seeing things differently than everyone else expects you to. And I've been seeing things very differently lately." A security guard materialized beside us, summoned by someone in the crowd who'd decided this entertainment had gone on long enough. He was young, probably early 20s, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he took his job seriously but had never dealt with anything more complicated than escorting drunk guests to taxis. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his hand resting on his radio. "This man is bothering the guests," Natalie said quickly, her voice steady again but her eyes still fixed on my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. He needs to be removed immediately. The security guard looked at me, wine-stained, holding a mop, wearing a janitor's uniform, then at the circle of well-dressed guests surrounding us. The power dynamic couldn't have been clearer. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, not unkindly, but with the authority of someone who'd made up his mind about the situation. I nodded slowly, setting the mop back in my cart. "Of course, officer. No problem at all." But as I began to wheel the cart away, I paused and turned back to Marcus and Natalie one final time. "Just one more thing, Mr. Reed," I said, my voice carrying further than it should have in the suddenly quiet ballroom. "You might want to be more careful about whose wine you're pouring. Sometimes the vintage is more valuable than you realize, and the owner might not appreciate seeing it wasted." Marcus's face went through several color changes, settling on a sickly gray. "What the hell are you talking about?" I smiled that same unsettling smile from before. "I'm talking about consequences, sir. Actions and reactions. Cause and effect. Basic principles that even a janitor can understand." The security guard touched my elbow, not roughly but firmly. "Sir, please." "Of course," I said, beginning to move toward the exit. Wouldn't want to keep the important people from their important conversations any longer than necessary. As we walked away, I could hear the crowd beginning to murmur, their voices a mixture of confusion and titillation. They'd just witnessed something that didn't fit their understanding of how the world worked, and they weren't sure what to make of it. But as the security guard escorted me toward the service exit, I caught fragments of their whispered conversations. "Did you see his eyes when Marcus poured that wine? How did he know Reed's name? Something about that man didn't seem right. The way he talked about wine, janitors don't know about Bordeaux vintages." I was almost at the exit when I heard Natalie's voice calling out behind us. "Wait," she said, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble, as she hurried to catch up. The security guard stopped, uncertain about protocol, when a guest wanted to speak with someone he was escorting out. She stood there for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made my chest tighten. This close, I could see the confusion in her eyes, the way she was trying to reconcile something that didn't make sense to her. "Do I know you?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant sound of the party resuming behind us. I met her gaze steadily. This woman who'd shared my name and my bed and my dreams for more than half my adult life. This woman who'd just watched another man humiliate me and felt nothing but irritation at the inconvenience. "No, ma'am," I said, my voice soft but carrying an edge that made her take a small step backward. "I don't believe you do. I don't think you ever have." Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or recognition, or fear. But before she could respond, I turned and walked through the service exit, leaving her standing there in her beautiful black gown, surrounded by the wreckage of assumptions that were about to become very, very expensive mistakes. The security guard followed me out into the service corridor, but his radio was already crackling with calls about something else. Apparently, someone had noticed irregularities with the evening's financial transactions. Something about the silent auction numbers not adding up correctly. I smiled to myself as I pushed the cleaning cart down the hallway. Phase 1 was complete. Now the real work could begin. I spent exactly 17 minutes in the service corridor, long enough to change out of the wine-stained janitor's uniform and into the custom-tailored tuxedo I'd left hanging in a storage closet on the 14th floor. The transformation was remarkable, from invisible maintenance worker to someone who belonged in that ballroom upstairs. But then again, I'd always belonged there. They just didn't know it yet. The security guard had escorted me to the service elevator and watched me leave, probably thinking his night had gotten easier with the removal of one problematic janitor. He had no way of knowing that the man stepping out of the executive elevator on the 15th floor 20 minutes later was the same person he'd just thrown out. The beauty of being underestimated is that people stop paying attention to details. I straightened my bow tie and checked my reflection in the polished elevator doors. Harold Whitman, majority shareholder and silent owner of Meridian Corporation, looked back at me. Not Henry Morrison, the janitor. Not the pathetic old man who'd just been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. The man who'd spent the last 6 months carefully documenting every financial irregularity, every suspicious transaction, every piece of evidence that would soon reshape several lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The recording device I'd been wearing under the janitor's uniform had captured everything. Marcus's arrogance, Natalie's cruelty, the crowd's complicity in my degradation. But more importantly, it had recorded Marcus mentioning specific details about tonight's auction that he shouldn't have known unless he was manipulating the bidding process. Details that, when combined with the financial forensics my private investigators had been conducting, painted a picture of embezzlement that would destroy both their careers and send them to prison. I walked back into the ballroom through the main entrance this time, past the same security guard who'd removed me earlier. He didn't give me a second glance. The power of a perfectly fitted tuxedo and the confidence to wear it is remarkable. I was no longer the help. I was someone who mattered. The party was in full swing, the earlier incident with the unstable janitor already fading into the background noise of gossip and speculation. A string quartet played something classical and forgettable while guests moved between the silent auction tables and the dance floor, their conversations a mixture of business deals and social climbing. I spotted Marcus first. He was standing near the bar, gesticulating wildly as he told what was probably an embellished version of his encounter with the crazy cleaning man. His audience, 3 men in expensive suits who laughed at all his jokes regardless of their quality, hung on his every word like he was describing a heroic victory rather than bullying behavior. "So I poured the entire glass right over his head," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone reliving a moment of perceived dominance. "You should have seen his face. These people need to learn their place, you know. Can't have them thinking they can just wander around wherever they please." One of his listeners, a man I recognized as the CEO of a competing firm, chuckled and shook his head. "Good for you, Marcus. Someone needs to keep the help in line. They get ideas above their station if you're not careful." "Exactly," Marcus agreed, taking a long sip of what looked like top-shelf whiskey. "The problem with this generation is they don't understand hierarchy. Everyone thinks they're special, everyone thinks they deserve respect they haven't earned. Sometimes you have to remind them how the real world works." I moved closer, staying just outside their circle but within earshot. The irony of Marcus Reed lecturing anyone about earning respect was almost too perfect. This was a man who'd inherited his position through family connections, who'd never worked a day of manual labor in his life, who thought that being born into wealth was the same thing as being worthy of it. "Speaking of keeping people in line," the CEO said with a knowing smile, "I heard you've been making some interesting adjustments to the auction procedures tonight. Very creative approach to maximizing revenue." Marcus glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "Let's just say I've found ways to ensure the highest bidders are properly motivated. Nothing illegal, just strategic information sharing." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. There it was, confirmation of what I'd suspected for weeks. Marcus had been feeding inside information to preferred bidders, allowing them to outbid others by minimal amounts while taking a percentage of the savings as kickbacks. It was elegant in its simplicity and completely illegal. "And your lovely partner in crime?" the CEO asked with a leer that made my hands clench into fists. "Natalie's been invaluable," Marcus replied, his voice warming with genuine affection. "She has access to all the donor information, knows exactly which pieces certain people will want most. We've been able to guide the bidding process very effectively." So it wasn't just an affair. It was a business partnership built on theft and fraud, with my wife as an active participant rather than just a victim of Marcus's manipulation. The betrayal had layers I was still discovering. I stepped into their circle with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. "Gentlemen, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about auction strategies. Fascinating stuff." The group turned toward me, their expressions shifting to the polite interest that wealthy men showed other wealthy men at social gatherings. Marcus extended his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't believe we've met. Marcus Reed, finance director here at Meridian." I took his hand, shaking it firmly while maintaining eye contact. "Harold Whitman. Pleasure to meet you, Marcus." For a moment nothing happened. Then I saw recognition begin to dawn in Marcus's eyes, starting as confusion and rapidly shifting to something approaching panic. His grip tightened on my hand as if he was trying to confirm that I was real. "Harold Whitman," he repeated slowly, his voice losing its earlier confidence. "That's right," I confirmed, releasing his hand and adjusting my cufflinks with practiced ease. "You know, it's funny. I was just downstairs a little while ago, and I could have sworn I saw someone who looked exactly like you pour wine over a janitor's head. Couldn't have been you, of course. Man in your position would never engage in such unseemly behavior." The color drained from Marcus's face so quickly I thought he might faint. The other men in the group looked between us with growing confusion, sensing tension but not understanding its source. You're... Marcus stammered. "I'm Harold Whitman," I said again, my voice conversational but carrying an undertone that made the other men step back slightly. "You know, the Harold Whitman who owns 47% of Meridian Corporation. The Harold Whitman who's been very interested in tonight's auction proceeds. The Harold Whitman whose signature appears on your employment contract." The whiskey glass slipped from Marcus's fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an echo of Natalie's champagne flute from earlier. The sound drew attention from nearby guests, but I didn't take my eyes off Marcus's face as he processed the full implications of what he'd just learned. "Oh, God," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I prefer Mr. Whitman, actually," I said with a smile that had nothing warm about it. "Though I suppose sir would also be appropriate, given our professional relationship." One of the other men, the CEO who'd been so enthusiastic about Marcus's illegal auction manipulation, cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should give you two some privacy to discuss business matters." "That won't be necessary," I said, my gaze never leaving Marcus's increasingly pale face. "I think Mr. Reed and I understand each other perfectly now, don't we, Marcus?" He nodded mutely, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. I could almost see him mentally reviewing every word he'd said to me as the janitor, every insult and threat calculating the damage to his career and his future. "Excellent," I continued. "Now, I believe you were telling these gentlemen about some interesting auction strategies you've been implementing. Please don't let me interrupt. I'm very interested in hearing more about these creative approaches to maximizing revenue." I wasn't... Marcus tried to speak but couldn't seem to find words. "You weren't what?" I asked, tilting my head with mock concern. "You weren't manipulating the bidding process? You weren't taking kickbacks from preferred bidders? You weren't using insider information obtained through your relationship with a certain member of our event planning committee?" Each question hit him like a physical blow. By the time I finished, Marcus was visibly trembling, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide the fact that he was a man whose world had just collapsed around him. "Please," he whispered, the word coming out as barely a breath. "I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," I said pleasantly. "In fact, I'm counting on it, but not here. This is a party, after all. We wouldn't want to spoil the festive atmosphere with unpleasant business discussions." I glanced around the ballroom until I spotted Natalie near the silent auction tables, her black gown making her easy to find among the crowd. She was laughing at something one of the other guests had said, playing the role of charming hostess with the practiced ease of someone who'd never had to worry about consequences for her actions. "I think it's time I reintroduced myself to my wife," I said, turning back to Marcus with that same cold smile. 26 years of marriage, and I have a feeling she's forgotten some important details about our relationship. Perhaps you'd like to join us for that conversation." Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. "Mr. Whitman, please, I need you to understand—" "What I understand," I interrupted, my voice still, conversational but carrying enough steel to cut through his panic, is that you poured a 1997 Bordeaux over the head of the man who signs your paychecks. What I understand is that you called me a pathetic toilet cleaner while stealing money from the company I own. What I understand is that you've been sleeping with my wife and using her access to commit fraud. Each statement landed with surgical precision. Marcus swayed slightly, gripping the edge of a nearby table for support. The question now, I continued, is what we're going to do about it, and by we, I mean what I'm going to do about it, since you've rather thoroughly demonstrated that your decision-making skills are questionable. I straightened my jacket and checked my watch, a vintage Rolex that had been my father's, worth more than Marcus made in 6 months. I think 15 minutes should be enough time for you to compose yourself and decide whether you'd prefer to resign quietly or be terminated publicly. Your choice. With that, I walked away, leaving Marcus standing there among the wreckage of his arrogance and the growing awareness that he'd just made enemies of the two most dangerous people he could have chosen, the man who controlled his livelihood and the husband of the woman he'd been stupid enough to fall in love with. As I made my way across the ballroom toward Natalie, I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following my progress. Word was already spreading through the crowd that something significant had just happened, that the balance of power in the room had somehow shifted in ways they didn't yet understand. But they would. Very soon everyone would understand exactly who Harold Whitman was, and what happened when you mistook his kindness for weakness. I was halfway to my wife when my phone vibrated with a text message. I glanced down at the screen and smiled. The message was from my attorney. Divorce papers filed, asset protection complete, you're clear to proceed. Perfect timing, because the real conversation was just about to begin. Natalie saw me coming before I reached her. I watched the exact moment recognition hit, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips, her social smile faltering as her brain struggled to process what her eyes were telling her. The janitor, who'd been humiliated and escorted out 23 minutes ago, was walking toward her in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, moving with the confidence of a man who owned everything around him. Because I did own everything around him, the building, the company, the event itself, all of it belonged to me in ways that would soon become devastatingly clear. Harold? The word came out as barely a whisper, her voice cracking on the second syllable. The woman beside her, Mrs. Patterson from the Historical Society, looked confused by Natalie's sudden pallor. "Hello, Natalie," I said pleasantly, as if we'd just run into each other at the grocery store rather than at a charity gala where she'd watched her lover pour wine over my head. "You look beautiful tonight. That dress is stunning." It was stunning. A black Valentino gown that probably cost $8,000, paid for with money from the joint account I'd been funding for 26 years while she stole from the company and cheated on our marriage. The irony was almost artistic. Mrs. Patterson, sensing tension but not understanding its source, excused herself with the kind of polite awkwardness that wealthy people use to escape uncomfortable situations. Smart woman. This conversation was about to get very uncomfortable indeed. "Harold, what are you doing here?" Natalie's voice was stronger now, but I could see her hands trembling as she set down her champagne flute. Why are you dressed like that?" "Like what?" I asked, smoothing down my lapels. "Like someone who belongs at a corporate charity gala? Like someone who might have a legitimate reason to be here?" Her eyes darted around the ballroom, probably looking for Marcus, wondering if he'd seen me yet and what that might mean for both of them. She had no idea that her lover was currently standing near the bar, trying not to vomit into a potted plant as he contemplated the complete destruction of his life. "I don't understand," she said, but there was something in her voice that suggested she was beginning to understand all too well. "Really?" I tilted my head, studying her face with the kind of attention I used to reserve for reading financial reports. "You don't understand how your husband might end up at the same event as his wife? How unusual would that be, really? But you weren't invited. I didn't put your name on the guest list." "No, you didn't," I agreed. "You didn't think I belonged here with your important friends and your sophisticated colleagues. You thought I was too simple, too ordinary, too boring for an event like this." Color began returning to her cheeks, and with it, a familiar spark of irritation. This was the Natalie I'd come to know over the past few years, the one who was annoyed when reality didn't conform to her carefully constructed narrative. "Harold, you're being dramatic. It wasn't personal, it was just, this isn't really your scene. You would have been miserable here." "My scene," I repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me, Natalie, what exactly do you think my scene is?" She gestured vaguely, as if the answer were obvious. "You know, quiet evenings at home, maybe dinner with your old work friends from the construction days. Simple things. There's nothing wrong with that, Harold. Not everyone needs to be comfortable in environments like this." I felt that familiar cold calm settling over me, the same feeling I'd had when Marcus poured wine over my head. 26 years of marriage, and my wife had convinced herself that I was some kind of simple laborer who'd gotten lucky with a few smart investments. She had no idea what I'd actually built, what I'd actually accomplished, what I was actually capable of. "Construction days," I said softly. "Is that what you think I did? Construction work?" "Well, yes, you worked construction, saved some money, made some investments. You've done well for yourself, Harold, but—" She trailed off, clearly not wanting to finish the thought. "But not well enough to belong here," I completed for her. "Not successful enough to move in your circles, not sophisticated enough to understand the complexities of corporate finance or high society fundraising." She had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but not enough to take it back. "Natalie," I said, my voice still conversational but carrying an edge that made her step backward slightly, "I need to tell you a story. It's about a young man who started with nothing and built something extraordinary through decades of careful planning and strategic thinking. A man who understood that real power comes not from making noise about your success, but from accomplishing your goals while others underestimate you." "Harold, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Whitman Holdings," I said, watching her face carefully. "Ever heard of it?" A flicker of recognition crossed her features. Whitman Holdings was one of the largest private investment firms in the region, with holdings in everything from real estate to technology startups. She'd probably seen the name in business magazines or heard it mentioned in the financial news. That's a major corporation," she said slowly. "Yes, it is. Founded 34 years ago by a young man who'd been working construction to pay for night classes in business and finance, a man who understood that building wealth requires patience, intelligence, and the ability to see opportunities others miss." Her face was going pale again, but this time it was the pallor of dawning comprehension rather than shock. "Harold, you're not saying—" "I'm saying that the construction worker you married was already worth $2 million when we met, and he'd been quietly building an empire while you thought he was just another blue-collar guy with a good heart and modest ambitions." The truth hit her like a physical blow. I could see her mentally reviewing our entire marriage, reframing decades of memories through this new lens. All those times I'd been working late, I'd been managing a business empire, all those small investments I'd mentioned, they'd been multi-million-dollar acquisitions, all those business trips she'd thought were construction contracts, they'd been board meetings and strategic planning sessions. But you never said— I never said what? That I was wealthy? That I was successful? That I owned the very building we're standing in right now? That last piece of information nearly knocked her off her feet. She gripped the edge of a nearby table, her knuckles white against the marble surface. "You own Meridian." "Corporation?" The words came out as barely a whisper. 47%, I confirmed. "Controlling interest, which means I own the company where you work, where your lover works, where you've both been systematically stealing money for the past 8 months." The accusation hung in the air between us like a blade waiting to fall. Natalie's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to form words. "I don't know what you think you know, but—" "I know about the auction manipulation," I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying enough steel to cut through her denials. I know about the kickback scheme with Marcus. I know about the inflated vendor contracts and the skimmed percentages. I know about the $750,000 you've both stolen from this company over the past 8 months. Each piece of evidence hit her like a separate blow. By the time I finished, she was gripping the table so hard I thought she might break her fingers. "Harold, please, you have to understand." "What I understand," I said, stepping closer and lowering my voice so only she could hear, "is that my wife has been stealing from me while sleeping with another man. What I understand is that you've been taking money from our joint accounts to fund your affair while embezzling additional funds from my company. What I understand is that you watched another man pour wine over your husband's head and felt nothing but annoyance at the inconvenience." Tears began sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic, of someone who just realized that their carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "About the affair? 6 months. About the embezzlement? 3 months. About the specific details of tonight's auction fraud? About 47 minutes. And you said nothing?" I smiled, and this time it was genuinely amused rather than cold. "Natalie, I've spent 26 years saying nothing while you slowly erased me from your life. I said nothing when you stopped asking about my work. I said nothing when you stopped inviting me to events like this. I said nothing when you started treating me like an embarrassment rather than a partner. That's not... I never... You never what? You never made it clear that you thought you'd married beneath yourself. You never acted like you were doing me a favor by staying with the simple construction worker who couldn't possibly understand your sophisticated world." She couldn't deny it because it was true. For years she'd been pulling away from me, creating distance between us that she'd convinced herself was natural evolution rather than calculated rejection. She'd wanted the financial security I provided while despising what she thought was the limited life I could give her. "I want a divorce," I said simply. The words seemed to break whatever composure she had left. She let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, the kind of noise people make when their world stops making sense. "Harold, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can..." "No," I said firmly. "We can't. Because this isn't about communication problems or growing apart or any of the other euphemisms people use when marriages fail. This is about the fact that you never loved me. You loved what you thought I could become or what you hoped I might provide, but you never loved the man I actually was. That's not true." "It is true, and the proof is standing 20 feet away, trying not to vomit into a champagne bucket as he realizes that his career is over." She turned to look toward the bar, where Marcus was indeed looking green around the gills as he stared at his phone, probably reading the first of what would be many very unpleasant text messages from his supervisors and colleagues. "Marcus doesn't mean anything," she said desperately, turning back to me. It was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake." $750,000 is not a meaningless mistake, Natalie. 8 months of systematic fraud is not a meaningless mistake. And the way you looked at me tonight when you thought I was just some pathetic janitor, that wasn't a mistake either. That was the truth. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it out to her with the same casual gesture I might use to hand someone a business card. "Divorce papers," I explained as she stared at the envelope without taking it. "Already filed, along with criminal fraud charges against both you and Marcus. My attorneys have been working overtime to make sure everything is properly documented." She finally took the envelope, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "You can't do this," she whispered. "We've been married for 26 years. We have a history together. We have..." "We have nothing," I interrupted, my voice final. "We had nothing real, Natalie. Just an illusion that I maintained and you exploited. But illusions eventually shatter, and tonight was the night ours finally broke." I turned to walk away, but her voice stopped me. "What happens now?" she called out, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look. I glanced back at her, this woman who'd shared my name and my home and my life. while never really knowing who I was or caring enough to find out. Now you face the consequences of your choices, I said simply. Both of you. As I walked away, I could hear her calling my name, her voice growing more desperate with each repetition. But I didn't look back. I was done looking back. The real Harold Whitman was done hiding, and it was time for everyone to learn exactly what that meant. The security office on the 10th floor of the Meridian building was spartanly furnished, gray metal desk, 2 folding chairs, and a bank of monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. It wasn't a place designed for comfort, which made it perfect for the conversation I was about to have. Marcus sat in one of the folding chairs, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled and his bow tie hanging loose around his neck like a noose waiting to tighten. He'd aged 10 years in the past hour, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed look of a man watching his life disintegrate in real time. Natalie sat beside him, her black Valentino gown a stark contrast to the institutional gray of the walls. She'd stopped crying, but her makeup was streaked and her hands trembled every time she reached for the tissue box between them. I stood with my back to the small window that overlooked the city, letting them sit in silence for several minutes before I spoke. Sometimes the anticipation of judgment is more effective than the judgment itself. I want you both to understand something, I said finally, turning to face them. This isn't about revenge. This is about consequences. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. Mr. Whitman, please, if we could just— Be quiet, I said softly, and he shut his mouth immediately. The authority in my voice surprised even me. 26 years of being dismissed and underestimated had taught me how to use silence as a weapon, but I'd never turned it on people whose lives I held in my hands. I walked over to the desk and opened a thick manila folder I'd placed there earlier. Inside were photographs, financial records, surveillance footage, and recorded conversations. The complete documentation of their betrayal compiled over 3 months of careful investigation. Marcus, I said, pulling out a photograph of him entering a hotel with Natalie. Do you recognize this image? He glanced at it and nodded miserably. This was taken on March 15th, the same day you approved an invoice from Prestige Events for $63,000, $48,000 more than their actual services cost. The difference went into an account that you and my wife have been using to fund your relationship. I set the photograph on the desk and pulled out another document. This is a record of the deposit made that same afternoon. $48,000 split evenly between 2 accounts, your account and hers. Natalie made a sound like a wounded animal. Harold, please. I'm not finished, I said, my voice still calm but carrying an edge that made her flinch. That was just one transaction. Over the past 8 months, you've systematically inflated vendor contracts, manipulated auction results, and skimmed percentages from legitimate donations. $750,000 in total. I pulled out a stack of bank statements and spread them across the desk, like cards in a poker game. Luxury hotel stays, expensive dinners, designer clothes, jewelry, a weekend trip to Napa Valley that cost more than most people make in 6 months, all of it. Paid for with money you stole from the company I built. Marcus buried his face in his hands. I can pay it back, every penny. I have assets, investments. No, I said simply. You don't. I reached into the folder and pulled out another set of documents. These are foreclosure notices for your house in Westchester. These are garnishment orders for your investment accounts. These are liens against your car, your boat, and your country club membership. You see, Marcus, when you steal from someone, you give them certain legal rights I've been exercising very thoroughly over the past week. His head snapped up, his face white with shock. You can't. That's my home. My family's home. Was your family's home? I corrected. Now it belongs to the bank that holds your mortgage, which, as it happens, is a subsidiary of one of my companies. Amazing how these things work out. Natalie was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Harold, you're destroying his family, his children. I'm not destroying anything, I said, turning to face her fully. I'm simply allowing the natural consequences of his actions to unfold. When you steal $750,000, there are financial repercussions. When you commit fraud against a major corporation, there are legal repercussions. When you humiliate and degrade the person you're stealing from, there are personal repercussions. I picked up another photograph from the desk. This one showing Marcus pouring wine over my head while I stood there in my janitor's uniform. Someone in the crowd had been taking pictures, and my private investigators had acquired copies within hours. "This image has been very helpful," I said conversationally. "It establishes premeditation and malice. It shows that you weren't just stealing money, you were actively degrading the victim of your crimes. Prosecutors love evidence like this." Marcus looked at the photograph and made a sound like he was choking. I didn't know who you were. If you'd known I was wealthy and powerful, you would have treated me with respect," I finished for him. "But since you thought I was just a janitor, just someone beneath your notice, you felt free to humiliate me for your own amusement." "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," I said, my voice hardening. "You poured wine over an innocent man's head because you could, because you thought there would be no consequences, because you believed that your wealth and position made you untouchable." I walked around the desk and stood directly in front of him. "How does it feel to be powerless, Marcus? How does it feel to have someone else control your future, your family's security, your very survival?" He couldn't answer. He just sat there shaking, finally understanding what it meant to be at someone else's mercy. I turned to Natalie, who was staring at me with a mixture of fear and something that might have been admiration. "And you. 26 years of marriage, and you never once asked about the details of my work. Never wondered how a simple construction worker could afford to pay for your lifestyle. Never questioned where the money was coming from." "I trusted you to handle the finances," she said weakly. "No," I said. "You didn't want to know. Because as long as you didn't know the details, you could maintain the fiction that you'd married someone ordinary, someone safe, someone who would never challenge you or threaten your sense of superiority." I pulled out the final document from the folder, our prenuptial agreement from 26 years ago. "Do you remember signing this?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the paper. "It was your idea?" I continued. "You insisted on it because you said you didn't want money to complicate our relationship. You wanted to make sure that if we ever divorced, we'd each keep what we'd brought to the marriage." "I remember," she whispered. "What you brought to the marriage," I said, setting the document on the desk between us, "was $38,000 in student loan debt and a used Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it. What I brought was a business empire worth $42 million. The number hit her like a physical blow. She'd known I was wealthy, but she'd had no idea of the actual scope of what I'd built. $42 million was more money than she could conceptually process, more wealth than she'd ever imagined being close to, let alone married to. "According to this agreement," I continued, "you're entitled to exactly what you brought to the marriage, adjusted for inflation. Your student loans were forgiven years ago, so effectively you're walking away with nothing." "That can't be legal," she said desperately. "Community property laws." "Don't apply when there's a valid prenuptial agreement," I finished, "which there is. Ironically, you're the one who insisted we have it reviewed by separate attorneys to make sure it was airtight. You were very concerned about protecting your interests." She was crying again, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and frustration and the dawning realization that her own greed and short-sightedness had trapped her in a prison of her own making. "You planned this," she accused. "You've been planning this for years." "No," I said honestly. "I hoped for years that you'd remember who you married, that you'd remember why you fell in love with me in the first place, that you'd stop treating me like an embarrassment and start treating me like a partner." I walked back to the window, looking out at the city lights that sparkled like diamonds against the black sky. "I would have given you everything, Natalie, not just money, everything. My love, my respect, my complete devotion. I would have built you a life that most people can only dream of." "You can still do that," she said desperately. "We can still fix this. We can go away together, start over somewhere new." "With what money?" I asked, turning back to face her. "You're unemployed as of tonight. Your accounts are frozen pending the fraud investigation. Your credit cards have been canceled. Your access to our joint accounts has been revoked. You have no assets, no income, and no prospects. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She looked around the security office like a trapped animal, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "You can't do this to me," she whispered. "I'm your wife." "We're my wife," I corrected. Past tense. "The divorce papers were filed this morning. The marriage is over, Natalie. It's been over for years. Tonight just made it official." I closed the manila folder and tucked it under my arm. "Security will escort you both from the building. Your personal belongings from the office will be shipped to whatever address you provide. Your final paychecks will be held pending the outcome of the criminal investigation." Marcus finally found his voice. What about criminal charges?" I paused at the door, considering the question. "That depends on how cooperative you are with returning the stolen funds and providing testimony about the full scope of the fraud. $750,000 is a felony amount, but prosecutors sometimes show leniency when defendants show genuine remorse and make full restitution." "We don't have $750,000 to return," Natalie said flatly. "No," I agreed. "You don't, which means you'll be paying it back in other ways. Marcus, your house will cover about $400,000 after the outstanding mortgage. Your car, boat, and other assets should cover another $100,000. The remaining $250,000, well, that's where things get interesting." I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Prison wages are approximately 23 cents per hour. At that rate, it would take about 47 years to pay off the remaining debt. Of course, you're both in your 50s, so you probably wouldn't live long enough to see the debt fully satisfied." The mathematical reality of their situation settled over them like a burial shroud. They would likely spend the rest of their lives paying for 8 months of greed and betrayal. "There is one alternative," I said, pausing with my hand on the door handle. They both looked up with desperate hope. "Complete confession, full cooperation with the investigation, testimony against any other individuals who might have been involved in similar schemes, and a public apology acknowledging the harm you've caused." "What kind of public apology?" Natalie asked cautiously. "The kind that appears in the business section of every major newspaper in the region. The kind that acknowledges not just the financial crimes, but the personal betrayal. The kind that makes it clear that your actions were motivated by greed, arrogance, and a fundamental lack of character." They stared at me in horror. For people who valued their reputations above almost everything else, public humiliation was a fate worse than prison. "You have 48 hours to decide," I said. "Choose wisely. It's the last choice you'll be making for yourselves for a very long time." I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving them alone with the wreckage of their lives and the knowledge that every single consequence they were facing was the direct result of their own choices. Justice, I reflected as I walked toward the elevator, was remarkably satisfying when it was both thorough and entirely deserved. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my new home overlooking Lake Travis, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and amber. The house was smaller than the mansion I'd shared with Natalie, only 4 bedrooms instead of 8. No formal dining room, no ballroom-sized living areas designed for entertaining people who never really wanted to be there. But it had something the mansion never had: peace. The coffee in my hands was still warm, steam rising from the ceramic mug that had been a housewarming gift from my sister. She'd driven down from Dallas the week after I moved in, bringing casseroles and questions, and the kind of unconditional support that I'd forgotten family could provide. We'd spent 3 days talking about everything that had happened, and she'd listened without judgment as I explained how thoroughly I'd been deceived, not just by Natalie's affair, but by my own willingness to accept being diminished in my own life. "You were always too generous for your own good," she'd said on her last night there, as we sat on this same deck watching the sunset. "Even when we were kids, you'd give someone your last dollar if they asked for it. But Harold, generosity stops being a virtue when people start taking it for granted." She was right. For 26 years, I'd been generous with my love, my money, my patience, and my dignity. I'd given Natalie everything she wanted while accepting less and less of what I needed. I'd convinced myself that was what love looked like, endless sacrifice, without expectation of reciprocity. But that wasn't love. That was enabling. The local newspaper was folded on the small table beside my chair, open to the business section. The headline still gave me a quiet satisfaction. Former Meridian executives sentenced in embezzlement case. The article was brief and factual, outlining the charges, the guilty pleas, and the sentences. Marcus Reed, 4 years in federal prison and full restitution of stolen funds. Natalie Whitman, 3 years and permanent disbarment from working in financial services. Both of them had chosen to cooperate fully with the investigation rather than face the public humiliation of a trial, which meant their crimes were documented in court records but hadn't become tabloid entertainment. I'd kept my word about the alternative I'd offered them. Their cooperation had been complete and their confessions detailed. The public apology had appeared in 6 major newspapers, acknowledging not just the financial crimes but the personal betrayals that had motivated them. Reading Natalie's carefully crafted statement about how her arrogance and sense of entitlement had led to devastating choices that harmed the man who had shown her nothing but love and support, had provided a closure I hadn't expected to need. The really surprising part was how little satisfaction I'd gotten from their downfall. For months leading up to that night at the gala, I'd imagined that watching them face consequences would feel like vindication. Instead, it had felt like necessary surgery, painful but essential for healing to begin. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I smiled when I saw the sender's name. Margaret Hoffman, the woman I'd been seeing for the past 2 months. We'd met at a volunteer event for literacy programs. She was a retired librarian who spent her Saturdays teaching adults to read, and I'd started helping with their financial literacy workshops. She was 61 years old, had silver hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, and possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that made every conversation feel like a discovery. "Good morning," her text read. "Coffee's ready whenever you are. No rush. The crossword can wait." Margaret lived in a cottage about 10 minutes away, and we'd fallen into a routine of sharing Sunday morning coffee and attacking the New York Times crossword puzzle together. It was the kind of simple domestic pleasure that I'd never experienced with Natalie, who'd considered crossword puzzles a waste of time and preferred to spend Sunday mornings organizing her schedule for the week ahead. I finished my coffee, locked up the house, and drove over to Margaret's place with the windows down and classical music playing softly on the radio. Her cottage sat on a small lot surrounded by oak trees that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. She was waiting on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee and the Sunday paper spread across a wicker table. "Any interesting news?" I asked, kissing her cheek before settling into the chair beside her. "The usual," she said with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Politicians being politicians, athletes being athletes, and business leaders making questionable decisions. Nothing we haven't seen before." She didn't mention the article about Natalie and Marcus, though I knew she'd seen it. Margaret was remarkably tactful about my past, never pushing for details but always ready to listen if I wanted to share. She understood that some stories needed to be told gradually, in pieces, when the teller was ready. "How's the foundation work going?" she asked, settling back with her coffee. I'd established the Whitman Foundation 3 months ago, focusing on financial literacy education and support for people who'd been victims of white-collar crime. It wasn't the kind of high-profile philanthropy that got your name on buildings or your picture in society pages. It was quiet, practical work that made real differences in individual lives. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now helping people recover from the kinds of crimes my ex-wife had committed. "Good," I said, pulling out my phone to show her pictures from the previous week's workshop. We had 37 people at the last seminar. Everything from basic budgeting to understanding investment fraud. There's such a hunger for this information, Margaret. People who've been taken advantage of because they trusted the wrong person or didn't understand the fine print. She studied the pictures with genuine interest. You're doing important work, Harold. There's something beautiful about turning your own experience into a way to help others avoid the same pain. It was beautiful in its way. Every person who learned to recognize financial manipulation was someone who might avoid the kind of systematic exploitation I'd experienced. Every individual who gained confidence in managing their own money was someone who couldn't be controlled through economic dependence. We spent the next hour working on the crossword puzzle, our heads bent together over the newspaper as we debated 7-letter words for betrayal and 5-letter words for renewal. Margaret was better with literature clues, while I handled anything related to business or mathematics. We made a good team. 47 down, she said, tapping the paper with her pen. 9 letters. What comes after reckoning? I thought about it for a moment, considering various possibilities. Then I smiled and reached for the pen. Atonement, I said, filling in the squares. She looked at me with those wise brown eyes that seemed to see everything. Is that what you think comes after reckoning, atonement? For some people, I said. The ones who are capable of recognizing what they've done and genuinely wanting to make amends, but not everyone reaches that point. And for the others? For the others, I think what comes after reckoning is simply consequences, natural, logical results of their choices, not punishment exactly, just reality finally catching up. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And for the victims, what comes after reckoning for them? That was the question I'd been living with for 6 months. What did come after surviving betrayal, after achieving justice, after walking away from everything that had defined your life for decades? Peace, I said finally. If they're lucky, they find peace. She reached over and took my hand, her fingers warm and steady against mine. Have you found it? Peace? I looked around her small garden, where morning glories climbed a trellis and tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. I thought about my new house with its modest rooms and spectacular views. I thought about the foundation work that gave my days purpose and meaning. I thought about Margaret herself, whose presence in my life felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. I'm getting there, I said honestly. The truth was that peace wasn't a destination you arrived at. It was a practice you cultivated. Every day I chose not to think about Natalie and Marcus was a day I invested in my own healing. Every morning I woke up in a house where I was respected and appreciated was a reminder that I deserved better than I'd been accepting. Every conversation with Margaret that challenged my mind and lifted my spirits was proof that real intimacy was possible when both people showed up as their authentic selves. My phone rang, interrupting our comfortable silence. The caller ID showed my attorney's number, and I briefly considered letting it go to voicemail. But Sunday morning calls usually meant something important had happened. Harold, came David's familiar voice when I answered. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just coffee and crosswords, I said. What's going on? I wanted to let you know that the last of the restitution payments came through this week. The full $750,000 has been recovered and returned to Meridian Corporation's accounts. I felt a quiet satisfaction at the news, but not the triumph I might have expected. How did they manage the final payment? Marcus sold the boat and his wife sold her jewelry collection. Apparently she's been very motivated to help clear the debt so they can start rebuilding their lives when he gets out. So Marcus's family had rallied around him despite his crimes. Part of me was glad for them. His children didn't deserve to suffer for their father's choices, but I couldn't help thinking about how different things might have been if Natalie had shown even a fraction of that loyalty to our marriage. There's something else, David continued. I got a call from Natalie's attorney yesterday. She wanted to know if you might consider meeting with her. The request caught me completely off guard. Meeting with her? Why? She didn't say specifically, but her attorney implied it was about closure, some kind of conversation she feels she needs to have before she starts serving her sentence next month. I closed my eyes, feeling Margaret's hand tighten slightly around mine in silent support. The last thing I wanted was to revisit that chapter of my life, to give Natalie another opportunity to manipulate or deceive me. But there was something in David's tone that suggested he thought it might be worthwhile. "What do you think?" I asked. "Honestly, I think she's finally beginning to understand what she lost. Her attorney says she's been in therapy, working on understanding how her choices affected other people. It might be worth hearing what she has to say." I thought about it for several minutes while Margaret and David waited patiently for my response. Did I owe Natalie the opportunity to apologize? Did I owe myself the chance to hear it? "Tell her attorney that I'll consider it," I said finally. "But if I agree to meet, it will be on my terms. Public place, limited time, and no expectation of reconciliation or forgiveness, just whatever she feels she needs to say." "I'll pass that along," David said. "And Harold, whatever you decide, you've handled this whole situation with more grace than most people would have managed. You should be proud of that." After I hung up, Margaret and I sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. "Are you going to meet with her?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me thinks it would be good to hear what she has to say, but another part of me worries that I'm finally at peace, and seeing her might disturb that." "Peace that can be disturbed by one conversation isn't really peace," Margaret observed gently. "It's just the absence of conflict. Real peace is strong enough to withstand difficult moments." She was right, of course. If I was truly healing, truly moving forward, then I should be able to face Natalie without being pulled back into old patterns of pain and resentment. "Besides," Margaret added with a small smile, "you might find that seeing her confirms just how far you've come. Sometimes we need reminders of what we're no longer willing to accept." That evening I called David back and agreed to the meeting. We arranged it for the following Tuesday at a quiet cafe downtown, public enough to feel safe, private enough for honest conversation. I felt nervous about it, but not afraid. Whatever Natalie wanted to say, I was strong enough to hear it and secure enough in my new life to let it pass through me without taking up residence in my heart. As I went to bed that night in my peaceful house overlooking the lake, I realized that Margaret had been right about peace. It wasn't the absence of difficulty, it was the presence of strength. And for the first time in 26 years, I felt truly, deeply strong. The reckoning was complete. Now came the rest of my life.